Welcome to Lunch with California Common Cause, our now monthly opportunity to chat with members and others interested in building a better and more inclusive California democracy. I'm Jonathan Mehta Stein, the Executive Director at California Common Cause. In 2020, we hosted this live stream weekly. There was a ton going on. There was major changes to our election system. There was the census, there was the beginning of the redistricting cycle, and there was our massive voter protection and poll monitoring efforts in the November 2020 election. We're making some changes for 2021. We've moved to monthly, at least for now, and a Wednesday in the middle of each month, as we reset a little and look to the future. We're also trying to bring in a little bit of branding, which is why you see the bright, big background behind me. Common Cause last year celebrated its 50th anniversary, and we're looking forward to 50 more years. As I will share in a moment, we've got tons of work already underway in 2021 that we're thrilled to share with you. But I want to mention first that we have two very, very special guests today. We're joined by Angelo Ancheta and Michelle DiGuilio, two members of the very first California Citizens Redistricting Commission, the independent community-run redistricting commission that drew our congressional district lines and state legislative lines 10 years ago. As the next Citizens Redistricting Commission begins its work, we'll talk with Michelle and Angelo about their experiences and their lessons for that new commission. But first, an update on our work. So, as I mentioned, the new Citizens Redistricting Commission is underway. It was seated last year, and it's meeting very, very regularly. It's meeting, their upcoming meeting on February, I believe, 24th to 26th, in which they're going to be talking about how to hire legal counsel and how to hire a demographer. They're in this stage of their work where there's a number of what we sometimes call business meetings. They're building out their infrastructure, they're figuring out their budget, they're going to determining how they're going to do their work. Their community education meetings will be beginning soon. And then at some point later in this year, they'll begin the process of hearing from community about what they want, what the community wants district lines to look like. We'll be talking more about that today and in the months to come. The exact timeline is actually not known because of delays in redistricting data coming from the Census Bureau, which you've probably heard about in the news, and is going to require a lot of thinking by advocates and by experts inside the system to adjust as appropriate. In addition to monitoring the state redistricting process, we're also building out materials around local redistricting. We're monitoring independent and advisory redistricting commissions in LA County, LA City, San Diego County, San Diego City, and working with coalitions of community-based partners in those regions to help people get engaged and do advocacy where appropriate. In the Bay Area and in the Central Valley, we're fighting for independent redistricting commissions. We just joined a coalition of Central Valley-based partner organizations this week in calling for independent redistricting commissions for Fresno City Council and the Fresno County Board of Supervisors. If you want to get engaged on independent redistricting and want to get educated about what your redistricting process will look like at the local level, regardless of whether you're using an independent commission or if your city council or your county board of supervisors is drawing the district lines themselves, check out our website where we've put a number of new resources, and we have a 3-hour training video that you can watch. The URL for that is commoncause.org/local redistricting 2021. I want to also note just a few pieces of legislation that have been introduced here at the very beginning of the California legislative session, and want to raise that with you because you're going to be hearing more about these bills and other bills as you tune into future episodes of the Lunch with California Common Cause live stream. Our big bill for the year is going to be a lobbying reform bill that is being covered by Senator Allen. It's a really fascinating bill, though it may not sound like it at first blush. What happens in the California State Legislature is that in the third quarter, which covers the months of July, August, and September, an enormous amount of money is spent on lobbying. In 2020 and in 2019, in that quarter alone, over $100 million was spent on lobbying in Sacramento in both of those 2 years. But because of the way that we file our lobbying reports in California, the information only comes out towards the end of the year. That means all of the final committee votes, all of the floor votes in the Senate and the Assembly, and the governor's bill signing period all happen in a wash in lobbying spending, and the public, the press, and lawmakers themselves find out who's funding all that lobbying well after decisions on the bills have been made, and well after that information is useful. So we're trying to reform that. We're trying to capture more regular, more frequent reporting around lobbying activity in those peak periods and for the biggest lobbyist spenders. There's also pressure tactics that lobbyists and special interest groups use that are completely anonymous. So for example, you can take out what are called issue advertisements. You can target a lawmaker who is on the fence about a bill, and you can bombard their constituents with social media advertising or mailers or billboards, telling you as a constituent to contact your state senator, contact your state lawmaker, to vote no, to vote yes, to accept an amendment, or whatever the case may be. All of that advertising, if it was in the campaign finance space, if it was part of a campaign, would require really robust disclosure and transparency. But the reality is that because it's not part of a campaign, because it's part of a lobbying effort, no disclosure is ever needed, and no disclosure is needed on the ad. It will be totally anonymous, and it can be hard to ever find out who is responsible for those sort of lobbying pressure tactics. So we're trying to bring new transparency and disclosure to issue advertisements as well. Basically, it's the show us the money bill. We're trying to bring greater transparency to California's lobbying process. The other bill that I want to mention to you, and you'll be hearing more about that bill in the months to come. The other bill I want to mention to you is something called AB 339. AB stands for Assembly Bill 339. And it would essentially make the remote access to government proceedings at the state and local level that we've seen across California in the pandemic era, it would make those permanent and would require that state and local governments make Zoom-based or phone-based remote access available to members of the public. So members of the public who can't attend government meetings in person because of work obligations or family obligations or transit and transportation difficulties or reasons of disability have a way to tune in and to make public comment. So we'll be tracking both of those bills and lots more over the course of the next several months. With that, though, I want to turn now to our guests. I'm thrilled to share with you a little bit about two fabulous members of the 2010 Citizens Redistricting Commission. Michelle DiGuilio describes herself as an ordinary citizen who had an extraordinary opportunity to serve on the inaugural Citizens Redistricting Commission. She was one of the 4 no-party preference commissioners. She's a native coastal Californian, but Michelle has spent the last 20 years working with numerous agencies in California's Central Valley. Currently, she works in logistics for the City of Stockton Fire Department and keeps busy with work, outdoor adventures, and the rewarding chaos of life with her husband and 4 kids. Welcome, Michelle. Angelo Ancheta is an attorney and academic who specializes in civil rights, constitutional law, electoral politics, and appellate advocacy. He has practiced law and has been an executive director for nonprofit organizations in both Northern and Southern California. Angelo was one of 5 Democratic members of the first California Citizens Redistricting Commission and served for a portion of that last decade as chair of the commission. Welcome, Angelo.
Jonathan.
All right, folks, so let's jump in. I want to ask you to start at a really basic level. Can you share with our viewers why, in your view, redistricting is so critically important? It's something you dedicated a decade of your lives to. What was behind that? Michelle, why don't I start with you?
I think a simple answer is it's one of the ways that people can most connect to their representation. I think redistricting allows for individuals, citizenry to be represented by people who share their interests first as well. And I think some of the redistricting reform that's going on brings that closer to a more accurate representation of what the people are in their constituent base. So that's kind of the easy answer. I'll let Angelo's go maybe more in depth.
Yeah, well, I think one of the important things to think about in terms of redistricting is that the lines often determine who runs for office, makes it more likely for certain candidates to win office. And as Michelle mentioned, it's really tied in with representation. It tells you or gives you a good sense of like who from that particular district within those set of lines and boundaries is going to represent the people who live in those districts. So ultimately, it is about representation, but when you start adding all the numbers together, it is about political power too. So we know, for example, in California that we still have a fairly large margin between Democratic representatives in the state legislature and Republican representatives. And it's a primarily Democratic congressional delegation, and that reflects sort of the makeup of the electorate. But depending on how you draw the lines, it can make a really big difference in terms of who's actually getting into office, and that power division, particularly in the state legislature, determines what legislation passes, what gets signed into law. So it's very important in terms of the allocation of political power.
Right. Yeah, there are states across the country where we've seen, a Republican state, and there's Democratic versions of this, a Republican state in which the vote overall, let's say for president or for governor in that state, is 60-40 Republican Democrat, but the congressional representation is 90 Republican, 10 Democrat, on a percentage basis or whatever the case may be. And there are Democratic states where that is flipped. And it's because of the nature of the district lines. It really does impact representation, Michelle, as you mentioned, and political power, as you mentioned, Angelo. So your commission was the very first of its kind in the nation. It was an experiment. And 10 years later, that experiment has essentially become the best practice for the nation. And the California model has spread to other states and has spread to cities and counties around California. In your view, what made it so successful? What was the secret sauce in that first Citizen Redistricting Commission? Angelo, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I think it would be partly because it was an experiment, and I think all of us were really dedicated to try to make the experiment work. I think we didn't necessarily going into it know exactly how we were supposed to do everything. We knew we had to produce maps at the end of the cycle, but and we knew that the laws laid out how you were supposed to do it and the process for getting input and all the criteria. But I think if there's any kind of secret sauce, I think it's because everybody on that commission and all the folks who worked with the commission and the folks who participated in the process were really dedicated to making it work. I think if you ask us, what are your maps going to look like in several months? I don't think anybody knew really exactly how they were going to look, but I think we were all committed to making that process work. And I thought that, even folks on the commission who disagreed strongly in terms of, policy positions and how they might look at other areas outside of redistricting, we all sort of came together and said, well, this is really important. We have to work together across party lines or not non-party lines as well.
Yeah, and I agree with Angelo. I think there may not be any one thing you can point to for secret sauce, but I think there were a number of aspects. And I've always said, I believe it started with how well the proposition was written in order for us to do our job. It laid out clearly the parameters that everything from how the commission was selected through how it would operate through the final line drawing. And I think along those lines, one of the big secret sauce things might have been an ingredient was the transparency. I think everything we did was open to the public, both in person and online, and still archived somewhere. Some poor soul has had the job of archiving that. But I think that really, it held the commissioners accountable, and it also allowed the public to have confidence in the process as well, too. And then ultimately, definitely to piggyback on what Angelo said, I think everyone there, all 14 commissioners were committed. I think we knew at the very beginning, success wasn't just coming up with the maps and improving the maps, but it was the confidence that the voters had put into the commission to do the job was also on the line as well, too. So I think we felt the weight of that in terms of us being working collaboratively, even when we disagreed, to come up with a solution.
Yeah, I remember, Michelle, to your point about transparency, I remember 10 years ago, at the very beginning, more than 10 years ago now, I was in law school and would travel up to Sacramento and watch the interviews. I don't know if I ever saw one of your two interviews, but I watched a bunch of the interviews and then watched the 3 state auditors who were responsible for making the selections deliberate on individual candidates in public at a dais. Anyone could go watch. And it was true again, just last year. We went and we watched. I watched a number of the interviews live streamed. And prior to the pandemic, was able to sit in a room in Sacramento and watch the deliberations of the three auditors selected this time around. It sets the tone for transparency for the public right from the start, and that's true of all of their meetings now and their deliberations now as well. And I do think you're right that it sort of upholds the ultimate purpose behind the measure and is sort of in the spirit of what the voters were getting at.
Yeah.
And so, Angelo, if you could paint for us the picture of the 2001 redistricting process in California and the 2011 redistricting process that you all led. Like, what? Show us, if you can, how they were different and what the key contrasts were.
Yeah, so, well, the 2001 process was the old process, which is basically the state legislature was charged with drawing the lines. And that's how it had been for a number of decades. Although in a couple cycles, because of there being a Republican governor and a Democratically controlled legislature, the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court actually ended up drawing the lines. But the normal process is for the legislature, with various committees meeting and having some hearings to draw those lines and then ultimately produce a set of maps that we produce it in the same process in 2011. The big issue, and this is what's built into the Voters First Act, Prop 11 and Prop 20, that were the basis for our work. We're basically, well, the problem, of course, with that system is that there's a strong incumbency interest among many, if not all, of the legislators to try to maintain their lines, to stay in a safe district. And in particular, the 2001 cycle has been criticized very widely for the fact that it was what's been called a bipartisan gerrymander. And that is, even though you had a democratically controlled legislature, and like many states, when the party in power tends to draw lines favorable to their party, but especially in 2001, there was a lot of basically trading of things going back and forth between the parties. And in essence, everybody, including Democrat and Republican, got pretty safe districts. And the result was ultimately, within the first couple cycles, almost no turnover whatsoever in the legislature. You had the same people getting elected again, which isn't necessarily a bad thing depending on your district and how people want to be represented, but you're sort of locked into that kind of incumbency protection system. And then our system basically completely did away with that. The legislature's involvement is really very, very limited. They're certainly able to, or members are able to advocate before the commission, but ultimately they have a very limited role and only has to do with really the selection process for the commissioners, and at a very late stage where they can knock a few candidates out of the pool. But other than that, the legislature really isn't involved. So it's very different in terms of having a group of 14 citizens represented by multiple parties and different parts of the state and different backgrounds. That's a very different process and a very, very strong commitment to transparency and public input, which is not what you saw in the 2001 cycle.
Was the commission ever contacted by state lawmakers or congressional representatives who wanted to see a certain district for themselves or for someone close to them?
Yeah, not directly. There were obviously anybody, including an incumbent legislator, can certainly suggest a map. There are prohibitions,
essentially, in the same way that the public can. Yeah.
Sure. Now there are prohibitions on what the commission can do in terms of looking at incumbency and looking at partisan membership, those kinds of things. So you can't just sort of say, "Oh, here's a Democratic district. Can you draw it for me?" Because the commission can't actually draw a Democratic or Republican district per se. But you can certainly suggest and argue that there are common interests which are not necessarily tied to party, but they're tied to demographics, to minority representation, any number of factors that might say, well, this district needs to be kept intact or needs to be drawn in a certain way because the people have similar representational interests. So the commission system is designed to try to take as much as possible partisanship or at least balance it out among multiple partisans and nonpartisan, and really take incumbency protection completely out of the picture. So nobody can even get on the commission if they have close ties to either the parties or to any particular incumbent or candidate.
Right, and just to be really clear with our viewers, the commission is not permitted by law to do what might be called partisan gerrymandering to benefit one political party or another with the district lines. And if I recall correctly, it's not even allowed to consider where incumbent elected officials live, right? In a way that city councils and county boards of supervisors do all the time. They're drawing lines knowing where they live and where their colleagues live so that they can draw districts that make it easier for them to run in the future. You weren't even allowed to consider that information. Isn't that correct?
That's right. It's prohibited. Now, again, if someone comes in front of us and wants to argue, they can certainly push that. We weren't allowed to do that. And, I think as we were listening to testimony, they were sort of thinking, that sort of sounds like they're advocating for protecting an incumbent's district. And we're not going to say you can't say that, but obviously we were prohibited from even thinking about that kind of consideration. So you have to let the public know that there are laws and regulations that bind the commission.
Michelle, let me turn to you. Let's talk about community testimony. So one of the things that is unique about the commission approach is that it puts the community in the driver's seat. You held over 100 meetings up and down the state of California in order to hear from the members of the public about what they wanted their district lines to look like. What was it like hearing the public give testimony? Were there any powerful stories that you remember about community members coming forth to give voice to their needs and their interests?
Yeah, I think a lot of us on the commission would agree that was one of the, for lack of a better word, one of the best parts of being on the commission was the opportunity to go and hear from so many different people. We were all in one way or another familiar with many aspects of the state of California, but being able to hear firsthand from people was often powerful. It could be humorous, it could be sincere. Sometimes it was angry. People had, I think, maybe Angelo, we can remember some of the times that when we first came out, we started to hear testimony. I think there was, and rightly so, there was a lot of mistrust maybe, or not quite sure what we were going to do, and were we just going to do the normal thing, just 14 people versus legislators behind closed doors. And there were times when there's a little bit of animosity as well too. But I think the opportunity for people to express that, whether it was hope or frustration, really gave them an opportunity to see that their voices could be heard. And then I think after the draft maps came out and they realized A, it wasn't as bad as maybe what they all thought, but B, now they didn't feel there wasn't that what's going to happen. It was, oh, here's what's happened, let's comment. And it gave them an opportunity for the commission to be able to address the issues maybe where we got things wrong, where we got things right, and to hear from people. That back and forth was very valuable. And I think in the end, if we could do anything differently, we would have been able to have more time to get maybe another draft map in, to get more feedback from people, to refine around the edges. And that's what we were able to offer to the next commission with some of the changes when we were done. But in terms of, gosh, there really were so many stories. But I remember one in LA where a gentleman came and talked to us. And sometimes when you're dealing with districts that are so large, there's 480,000 people in an state assembly, 950,000 something, almost 1 million people in a state Senate district. You're going to be with a lot of other people. So when we would ask people is, what commonalities do you have with people in your communities? When you got in the really dense areas, we have to make a decision. We go here, we go there. And one gentleman came and said, listen, we'll be with this community over here, but over here we have a really big football rivalry. We can't be with them. We're just not alike. Over here is okay, but for him that was very important. And another time when we were dealing with the very far north of California, it's very sparsely populated, so people have to be put in very big geographically sized districts to accommodate the population. So we initially tried to do some things where we went across California in the north, and we went from the inland all the way into the coastal area. But we heard very clearly from people that that's the mountains, the geographic coastal range was a very big cultural difference between the two groups. Even though they're both rural, had some same economies of whether it be fishing or logging, but they would much rather, the central part of California would rather go down into northern Sacramento region rather than go across the coast. And so those nuances, while we as commissioners know those areas, we don't know what people there really think. And so the opportunity for people to tell us that not only gave them, I think, confidence in the system, but also really did help us as commissioners inform our decisions in terms of making those decisions and drawing the lines.
Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful to hear that districts were reshaped based on what people wanted. It's really powerful to hear that, particularly because I think right now, in so many ways, government feels untouchable. It feels distant. It feels non-responsive. To hear you say, like, people came forward and said, this is what they wanted, so we changed the map. I mean, it's a really powerful thing. Angelo, can you give us any specific anecdotes where you remember community participation driving the process or changing district lines?
Yeah, well, actually, I'll just piggyback on what Michelle said about Northern California. And one thing to remember is that 14 is not a representative body of all of California. You just can't get, even with folks having lived in the state for many years or lived in different parts of the state. There's just parts of the state people just have no idea what's actually going on in it. And I think really Northern California was really eye-opening for me, and just learning about the geography, and little things that are just somewhat trivial, like the pronunciation of one of the northern counties is not Del Norte, it's Del Norte. That's just how
That's right. Yep, that's right.
Up there, and you just realize, well, yeah, I guess we can't draw a district that way because it's basically snowed in, and in the wintertime you can't get any. You can't go from one side of the state to the other side of the state. And so it's really important, particularly when you're looking at more rural areas, just areas which tend to have lower density populations, to really get some input, because most of us came from either medium or larger cities, and that's obviously reflective of the population of the state, but it's a very big, very diverse state. And even though those districts up north and towards the east are quite large geographically, they've got the same number of people as even the most urban of districts. So yeah, it was just eye-opening to hear people, at least for me, from parts of the state I just had really only seen on a map or had maybe passed through on a drive up to Oregon, that kind of thing. So it really helps to get a sense, well, this is an important part of the state that I really know very little or nothing about.
Right.
And
well, so
Jonathan,
yeah, please, Michelle.
Sorry. I was just going to add one additional aspect, because I do think the public testimony was such an important part of the process. I think it also allowed for an educational aspect of the community. A lot of people that came did have some idea, but a lot didn't understand that we as a commission, our hands were tied. We had to make these districts a certain size. We had to work around the VRA issues. So we would often tell them, like, we want to hear from you, but here are the parameters. You have to, it's like going to, I would say, it's like going to a dance. Who do you want to go to the dance with, and who do you not want to go to the dance with? You have to have this many people with you. So I think it helped people to understand it wasn't just this abstract thing where a district would pop out and here's your representative. They thought, okay, I understand what has to be done, and let me give you my input within the context of this parameters. So that was also very, and it's not a sexy subject. Redistricting is not glamorous. But I think slowly over the years, I've seen a big change the last 10 years in how much it's been a part of good governance discussion and more part of common conversations, which is great.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And you mentioned the VRA, that of course is the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. It's one of several laws and rules that set the parameters you're talking about, that like you can draw district lines based on community input, but there are laws that you have to follow in the process of doing that. And so it's not sort of a blank canvas necessarily that you're starting from. Michelle, you mentioned that the community input was so important. And I'm wondering, how do you hear from the entire public when the public is 40 million people? I mean, it's such an enormous state. How did you go out and find people where they were and make sure that you could hear from all corners of the community?
Well, I do think one thing we did try and do is put our public meetings throughout the whole state as one way, first of all, to try and reach different parts of the state. I think we knew early on that it was going to be difficult. I remember one of our very early conversations, Angelo, and we were sitting up there in the second, we haven't been transitioned yet from the Secretary of State. And we had these ideas of holding 100, 200
Right.
input meetings. And logistically speaking, unfortunately, we couldn't quite do that. But I do think in the end, we did make some decisions. We opened up, of course, the public, but one thing that also happened were groups, some groups. We had a lot of the, I'm trying to remember, we had a Northern California session and a Southern California session that was just for larger groups that represented communities of interest. Some of the Southeast Asian communities, some of the African American communities, the LGBT community. What else? We had quite a few groups that we organized that came that hopefully represented larger groups. And we also had, to be honest, we had some legislators groups that came as well too. I remember one in Southern California that anyone was allowed to speak to us, to give us their point of view. And then we could have people to respond as a result. But it was, in the end, you're going to get people that come who probably have some knowledge and interest in redistricting, or those that maybe were successfully reached out to by organizations such as Common Cause or League of Women Voters. I think this commission, this go around, has an interesting challenge because of the nature of social media and because of the pandemic that we're in and Zoom. It'll be interesting for them. I think in the end, we would have loved to hear from even more people, but unfortunately with redistricting, it's just a time constraint. And now with some of the other challenges they face with the census, it'll be interesting to see how the new commission does with that as well.
So Angelo, you were 14 people of widely different backgrounds with different skill sets, different professional experience, different regions. You had to learn to work together very quickly, and you had to do it under enormous scrutiny, and you had to do it essentially in public view because of how transparent every single meeting was. How did you do it? I mean, how did you build the bonds you needed to be an effective team?
Well, I think if you look at people's backgrounds, then there's a wide range of experiences and where they're from in terms of location in the state, and a very well-educated group. I mean, I think if you're trying to say, is this a cross-section of California? It's not really a cross-section of all of the state, because it was very talented, very skilled, very experienced, well-educated group of people. So we can't say that we represent everybody in the state, but I think in particular everybody was strong at exactly that, being a team player and willing to work together to try to reach a common process and a common goal, which was to produce those maps. Not that we didn't stumble. I mean, there were plenty of disagreements on a lot of different things, how we interpreted the law, how we looked at our strategy for getting public input, how we ultimately drew lines. So it wasn't, it wasn't a perfect process, but I think we were all committed to being team players and to making sure that the process worked. As we mentioned at the very beginning, that this was a very big experiment, and we all wanted it to succeed. The process was just as important for us as the actual maps that were being drawn, because we had to, we had this sort of rather somewhat crude metaphor, but it was sort of accurate, which is not only are you flying the plane, you're also designing and building the plane at the same time that you're flying the plane. And that's how we felt, because we only had less than a year from the time the commissioners were seated to actually put these maps together, and it's a tremendously compressed period of time to draw 4 major maps for the entire state of California. So, but I think it was commitment to really work together as a team, and I think we had complementary skill sets. There were gaps as well. If you look at the current commission, a lot of different backgrounds, different skills, which is good to see too, because you want to have different perspectives and different sets of experience coming into this particular commission.
Michelle, what would you add to that, if anything?
Yeah, no,
how did you come together?
I would love to add, because yeah, and I would love to add, only because I think there is a real hidden secret to our success. I don't know if that's hidden, but we We did things together. We ate together. We traveled together. We spent a lot of time together. And of course, when we were not in commission work, we didn't discuss commission work, but that's when you got to know your fellow commissioners. You got to know people outside your political party. You got to know people outside your cultural background. You got to know people from different parts of the state. And honestly, I think in addition to all the rewarding aspects of being on the commission, getting to know 13 other people was really another incredible benefit to being on the commission. And I think it was only because we had spent time away from commission activities together. We'd have to be in Sacramento for a few days together. We would be on the road traveling to 3 or 4 different cities at a time. We would be in the cars together. We'd be on planes together. And really, if you get to know people and you recognize where you have commonalities, you recognize where you don't, and but you respect them as people. And when you respect them as people, when you get into those difficult conversations later on, when you're dealing with commission activities, when you're dealing with line drawing and making decisions, you understand them better and you understand where they're coming from. And you understand that regardless of your disagreements on the floor, you still will be able to walk out afterwards and have that common friendship even. So I think that was very valuable to the success of the commission too, was the ability for people to come to have enough respect for each other that you could come to consensus when you needed to.
What advice would you two give this new commission, which is undertaking its work with just as much public scrutiny as you all faced, but with the additional challenge of the pandemic, which makes some of the in-person meeting, Michelle, that you mentioned, difficult, the eating together, right? I mean, immediately, it's just, we live in another universe now where you said we ate together, and I was like, wait, you can do that? Like, you're allowed to, two people who aren't in the same pod or household can eat together? Like, how would you advise this new commission, either sort of pandemic related or not? What advice would you give this new commission that gets underway? Angelo, why don't you start?
Yeah. Well, that was what Michelle brought up, which was sort of the outside of the commission workspace, to actually try to get to know each other was really important. And that's something I think several of us expressed to them when a couple of us made comments or had conversations with some of the subcommittees of the commission. And it was saying you've got to really try to, as much as possible, given the constraints of having to do things via video conference, to try to get that set of connections. And I think they've tried to do. I'm not sure how often they actually do have sort of video conferencing that isn't work related, but I know they started doing that fairly early. And I think it's been helpful for them. It's a big challenge. I mean, hopefully they will, by later in the year, going into the fall, be able to have safe meetings where they can meet as a group and where they can invite the public in a safe environment. But there may be serious constraints that they have to face. So a lot of it will be over the internet, and I think that's a big challenge for any. As we all know, it's been a big challenge just in terms of how our normal lives are run and how we were able to participate in social life and particularly in political life. One of the big challenges they have as well is that the education and outreach efforts that we undertook in 2011 were strongly supplemented by support by major foundations like the James Irvine Foundation. And a big chunk of the current commission's budget is trying to fill the gap that now exists because a lot of the foundations and the philanthropic world is not allocating a lot of money for redistricting the cycle. So trying to fill that gap, and I know the commission is really working very hard to do extensive outreach and education in the next few months. That's a big project that we didn't have to spend as much time on because of the philanthropic efforts back in 2011. And they're a different group of people too. I mean, you have to realize that there are 14 individuals of different backgrounds and different aspirations in terms of how they want to see the commission work. From what I could tell, and I've listened to a few of the meetings, and I've been contacted a couple of times because they're trying to create sort of a historical background for some of their work. They're trying really hard to work together as a team, and I think they're largely successful so far. But yeah, it's really tough, particularly with I don't know how many of them. If some of them may have never seen each other in person, and I think that's a really big difference from our side.
I think that's right. Michelle, what advice would you give the new commission?
Oh gosh, advice. think Angelo talked a lot about the important aspects. I think the only thing in which we touched on just a little bit in the first commission get sorry, I'm kind of look like I'm frozen. I'm not okay. I think the thing that they'll have to deal with is quite a bit more testimony or information that will be coming to finding a way to synthesize that into usable formats, as COI testimony otherwise. I think that will be a big challenge for them. I have a feeling, I have not been watching them, maybe like maybe Angelo has, but I'm assuming that's something that's on their radar. We saw it a little bit with emails when we were dealing with our commission. We had to find ways to go through all that, because we made it a point to listen to all the testimony. We kind of broke it down into groups so that we could make sure we heard everybody's voice. But I can only imagine the amount of data that they'll be inundated with this round. So finding some of that. And again, just the ability to try and listen to as many people as possible and work collaboratively in very difficult situations.
Yeah, they're actually hiring a data manager. At least that's the intention.
Great.
Because it's specifically, I think, Michelle, they're anticipating what you're saying, which is they're going to get so much input from in a million different formats, and they're hiring the data manager to essentially synthesize that and make it useful for them. Last question for you both. If you were to, let's say you were to bump into a community member at the grocery store, and I'm trying to think of places where humans still might bump into each other. Let's say you're at the gas station or you're at the grocery store and you bump into somebody and they say, hey, you were on the Independent Redistricting Commission. I think we should have one here in the city of wherever. What would you tell them if they wanted to get engaged and get involved, and potentially they wanted to advocate for an independent commission in their local community? Angelo, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there was experience from 10 years ago, and it worked. I mean, I think we're very proud of the work we did in terms of the process, and we came up with a good set of maps. And I think it's so to at least say that it's possible to do that. Now, the challenge, of course, particularly for those folks who might want to push for a new commission, is that you may not have all the support you need to get that kind of commission. So. As was the case in 2008 and 2010, where you might have opposition from folks who are currently in power, you might expect the same kind of opposition at the local level. Members of city councils or school boards or county boards of supervisors, that they say, well, why? Well, we've done a pretty good job. We think this is fine. Why do you want to create this commission? It's going to cost a lot more. It's going to take a lot more time. We're under a really tight calendar at this point. So there's a sort of political realities you have to deal with whenever you're putting a reform in. But I'm certainly proud of our work, and I think as other states have gone to a commission system, and a lot of other localities in different parts of the country are moving toward that system, you can say, well, this actually can work, and it's a good system to adopt.
Michelle, what about you? What would you tell a neighbor or a community member who is interested in bringing these reforms to the local level?
I mean, again, I would also very much encourage them to follow this, because it's not just, I think it wouldn't be just about the end game of getting an independent commission on a local level, but it would be about informing the constituents about the importance of redistricting. I think, and I'll just speak to my community of Stockton, which has some very challenging socioeconomic demographics. And so I don't think that's redistricting is high on a lot of your everyday citizen, their minds. But I think if they understood why it was so important and why their input value mattered, I think if you started there, that would probably, in a community like mine, that would be the best route to go. And as you built up that community support and that community engagement, I think it'd be much easier to bring about some change at more of a collective level in terms of a commission, for whether it be a county level or a city level, or even a school district, a school board, whatever it may be. And it might not be a full commission, but it may be something that's just simply a group of citizens that gives testimony that says, we want to see you draw the lines. We don't want to see you do it behind closed doors. Why did you choose this and not this community? So I think all of those efforts do nothing but help build up community participation and good governance and lead to more accountability. And whether it's on small levels of simply testifying or whether it's actually able to get a full commission in place, I think all of those things ultimately bring about a better democracy and more fair.
I mean, that's a perfect place to end. Better democracy. Thank you both so much for joining us today and for a decade of service to California, and for setting an example for cities and counties around the state and potentially other states around the nation. I mean, we really do appreciate your service. To the folks at home, if you want to get involved with the new Citizens Redistricting Commission, the successors to Michelle and Angelo, visit wedrawthewines.ca.gov. You'll find information about upcoming meetings, about materials. You'll find materials from past meetings, and you'll find the history of the previous commission from 10 years ago. A ton of content is still up. The next meetings of the CRC, as I mentioned at the beginning, are February 24th through the 26th. They're getting themselves set up. So there'll be lots of discussion if you tune in about hiring legal counsel and hiring a demographer. I suspect there will also be some continued discussion of how to react to the continuing delays at the Census Bureau, which is now saying that redistricting data will not be available until September 2021. So we've got quite a ways to go, and we've got some changing of the timeline, I think, ahead of us. If you're interested in local redistricting in your city or your community, go to commoncause.org/local redistricting 2021, where we have a variety of resources. And as I mentioned, a 3-hour video that was a training we gave for city clerks and county clerks all over California. We'll see you again in the middle of March. For more regular updates, check out our social media. Our Twitter is @CommonCauseCA. My Twitter is @_Jonathan Stein. Angelo, Michelle, one last time, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you. And to our listeners and viewers, we appreciate you and your support of California Common Cause. Please stay safe. Till next time. Bye-bye.